In 2006, the machines inside the Electro-Voice factory in Buchanan, Michigan, finally stopped. The assembly lines were dismantled. The production moved to Mexico, and the ground beneath the building was eventually designated an EPA Superfund site, a toxic footprint left behind by decades of heavy industrial plating. It was a quiet, poisoned end for a facility that built the loudest and most indestructible voices in America. For over half a century, this was the empire that forged the constant directivity horns that powered stadium rock tours, the military microphones that survived battlefields, and the RE-20 broadcast microphones that still define the American voice today. The hardware was famous for being impossible to kill. A dropped Electro-Voice speaker would break the floor before it broke the driver. But while the equipment was bulletproof, the corporate foundation underneath it was highly fragile. The real story of Electro-Voice is not just the story of a contaminated, empty lot in Michigan. It is the story of how American engineering conquered the most hostile acoustic environments on Earth, only to be dismantled by the quiet math of corporate consolidation. Every week, we tell the stories of American speakers, audio brands, stereo stores, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, movies, and memory. And what happened when the market moved on? Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in South Bend, Indiana, in 1927. In 1927, in the basement of a building in South Bend, Indiana, two young engineers named Al Kahn and Lou Burrows opened a small business. They called it Radio Engineers. Their initial ambition was entirely local. They repaired radio receivers, the heavy, glowing wooden boxes that were rapidly becoming the center of American home entertainment. For 2 years, the business worked. Then came the stock market crash of 1929. The Great Depression arrived in the Midwest with ruthless speed. American families who could no longer afford groceries certainly could not afford to fix a broken radio. The repair tickets vanished. The revenue stopped. Kahn and Burrows were left with a basement full of tools, a deep understanding of audio circuitry, and a total lack of paying customers. To survive, they realized they could not rely on the American living room. They had to move outside. Before 1930, if an American listener stood at the back of a large crowd during a political rally, a county fair, or a sporting event, the experience was defined by silence or static. The American absence was clear. There was no reliable, high-quality way to amplify a human voice over a large outdoor space. Early PA speakers, public address speakers designed to project sound to a crowd, were fragile, underpowered, and notoriously unreliable. They were largely assembled from modified telephone parts. When pushed to high volumes, they produced severe distortion, unwanted change added to the sound by the speaker or amplifier, turning words into an unrecognizable metallic harshness. Kahn and Burrows scraped together whatever components they could find and built a portable public address system. It consisted of a primitive amplifier, a heavy speaker cabinet, and a microphone. They began renting the rig out to local events in South Bend for $3 a night. It was a desperate survival tactic, but it placed their engineering directly into the harsh, unpredictable environment of public sound. Then, in 1930, they received a request that would change the trajectory of American audio. Just a few miles away, at the University of Notre Dame, legendary football coach Knut Rockne was facing a physical crisis. Rockne was suffering from phlebitis, an illness that severely restricted his mobility. He could no longer run up and down the practice field. He could no longer yell over the noise of the players. He needed a way to direct his team from a raised tower. But standard megaphones were useless against the wind. He needed an electronic megaphone. He needed public address. Kahn and Burrows hauled their custom PA system to the Notre Dame practice field. They mounted a heavy speaker horn high on the tower. They handed the coach a microphone. But when Rockne spoke into the metal grill, his voice cut through the Indiana wind. It overpowered the sound of colliding leather helmets, It reached the farthest edges of the field with absolute clarity. The coach did not have to strain. The players did not have to guess. The system had solved a physical, environmental problem that standard acoustic megaphones could not. Rockne was thrilled. He reportedly referred to the towering speaker system as his electric voice. Kahn and Burroughs recognized the branding instantly. In July 1930, they officially changed their company name to Electro-Voice. The Notre Dame success proved that their amplifiers and speakers worked. It proved there was a market for rugged outdoor audio. But as their rental business expanded, they slammed into a massive engineering bottleneck. To rent out a PA system, they had to provide a microphone, a device that translates acoustic sound waves in the air into an electrical signal. At the time, they were purchasing double-button carbon microphones from external suppliers. These microphones were terrible, they were fragile, they absorbed moisture, they generated massive amounts of background hiss, and they cost $20, a small fortune during the Great Depression. Kahn and Burroughs were spending their hard-earned rental profits constantly repairing or replacing third-party microphones that could not survive the physical abuse of a working PA system. The speakers were strong, the amplifier was stable, but the system was only as reliable as the first point of contact. Kahn and Burroughs made a decision that shifted them from local renters to national manufacturers. They purchased a small South Bend lathe. They sourced their own magnets. They machined their own metal housings. They began building their own dynamic microphones from scratch. By designing the microphone, the amplifier, and the speaker as a single unified chain, Electro-Voice took total control of the audio signal. They began selling their microphones to other PA operators for $20, undercutting established competitors who charged significantly more for inferior, fragile designs. By the late 1930s, Electro-Voice had established a reputation for building audio equipment that simply refused to die. If you bought an EV microphone or speaker, you did not have to treat it like a delicate scientific instrument. You could throw it in the back of a truck. You could leave it in the rain. You could scream into it. They had built a profitable business out of the Great Depression by treating audio not as a luxury, but as industrial hardware. The local football field was loud, but a far larger and more dangerous noise was about to test the company's engineering. By the early 1940s, Electro-Voice had established a modest footprint in the American public address market. But the company's defining acoustic test did not occur on a football field or inside a theater. It happened inside a Sherman tank. When the United States entered World War I, the military faced a severe communication crisis. The battlefields, aircraft, and armored vehicles of the era were deafening. When an American soldier tried to speak into a standard military-issue microphone, the intense background noise of engines and artillery overwhelmed the transmission. The person on the other end heard only a roaring wall of distortion. In the most hostile environments, the rate of successful voice communication hovered around 20%. Orders were lost. Coordination broke down. The military needed a microphone that could hear the human voice, but ignore the war. Al Kahn and Lou Burroughs had already spent the 1930s solving electrical interference. In 1934, they had successfully implemented the humbucking coil, a secondary coil of wire wired in reverse to cancel out electrical hum and interference from nearby power sources. Now they applied that same logic of rejection to acoustic sound. They developed the T45 lip microphone. It was a differential noise-canceling microphone, a design that exposes both sides of the internal diaphragm to the open air, allowing background noise striking from all directions to cancel itself out while capturing the voice spoken directly into the front grille. The T45 was strapped directly to the face. It rested against the upper lip. When a soldier yelled into it over the sound of a tank engine, the background noise disappeared. The human voice cut through the static. Military tests showed that the successful communication rate jumped from 20% to over 90%. The T-45 became essential American combat hardware. The military ordered them by the hundreds of thousands. Practically overnight, Electro-Voice transformed from a small Midwestern audio shop into a massive defense contractor. When the war ended, Kahn and Burroughs took their military profits and made a geographic decision that would define the company for the next half-century. In 1946, they moved their headquarters from South Bend, Indiana, to a sprawling 64-acre facility just across the state line in Buchanan, Michigan. They built a massive factory, they hired local workers, and they realized that if they could engineer the front end of the audio chain, the microphone capturing the sound, they could dominate the back end of the chain. They began engineering the speaker. A speaker is simply a microphone operating in reverse. Instead of a diaphragm turning acoustic waves into electricity, a speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, uses electricity to push a cone and move the room. Electro-Voice applied its industrial survival mentality to American speaker manufacturing. They began producing highly sensitive drivers, massive woofers, and compression drivers. A compression driver, a high-efficiency driver that pushes sound through a small opening into a flared horn, was the only way to project clear sound across a large theater or an outdoor arena without needing thousands of watts of amplifier power. But EV did not just want to build stadium PA systems. They wanted to capture the American living room. In the 1950s, the American hi-fi boom began. Returning soldiers who had been exposed to high-quality electronic communication gear now wanted high-fidelity sound in their homes. Hi-fi, short for high fidelity, meaning sound reproduction that tries to stay faithful to the original recording, was moving from a niche hobby for engineers into a middle-class obsession. Electro-Voice looked at the fragile, underpowered residential speakers of the era and responded with brute acoustic force. They introduced the Patrician. The Patrician was not a subtle wooden box. It was a towering, corner-placed residential loudspeaker that stood nearly 5 feet tall. It was a four-way system, meaning it used a complex crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the specific drivers designed to handle them, to split the music across 4 massive components. At its heart was a staggering 18-inch woofer. But the woofer was not simply bolted to the front of the cabinet. The Patrician utilized a folded horn design. A folded horn, a speaker cabinet design that wraps a long, expanding acoustic path inside a wooden box. Used the walls of the American living room itself to extend deep bass frequencies, creating a physical impact that standard sealed boxes could not match. The physical presence of the Patrician was overwhelming. It was finished in fine mahogany or walnut veneer, a thin layer of attractive wood used on the outside of a speaker cabinet to make industrial hardware look like premium furniture. In the 1950s, a single Patrician speaker could cost over $700, at a time when a new American car cost roughly $2,000. It was not a casual purchase. It was an architectural commitment. The brand quickly earned the endorsement of the most demanding listeners in the country. The U.S. military trusted their microphones. The CBS radio network adopted their broadcast gear. Independent stereo stores in Chicago and New York used EV speakers to demonstrate the absolute limits of analog records. Regional hi-fi societies published glowing reviews of their drivers. When an American listener walked into a mid-century stereo showroom, sat down in the listening chair, and heard an orchestral record played through a Patrician, the effect was physical. The bass did not just hum, it pressurized the room. The brass instruments had the dynamic bite of a live performance. The speaker did not struggle, it cruised. Electro-Voice had successfully bridged the gap between the brutal utility of a battlefield and the luxury of a suburban living room. They had built an American audio moat based on extreme efficiency, bulletproof reliability, and scale. Electro-Voice had proven its cabinets and horns could outlast a war and dominate the living room. But the product was indestructible. The corporate foundation underneath it was not. By the late 1960s, the American audio landscape was splitting into two distinct arenas. The home listener wanted high fidelity in a smaller, more practical wooden box. The commercial broadcaster needed a microphone that made the human voice sound flawless, regardless of who was speaking. Electro-Voice, armed with the manufacturing scale of the Buchanan facility, decided to dominate both. In 1968, EV released a piece of hardware that would permanently alter American broadcasting, the RE-20. At the time, radio DJs, recording engineers, and broadcast announcers faced a frustrating physical problem called the proximity effect, an acoustic phenomenon where bass frequencies artificially inflate and become muddy when a speaker leans too close to a directional microphone. If a nervous guest or an energetic radio host moved an inch too close to the grill, the broadcast turned into a muffled roar. EV solved this with variable D technology, a physical engineering design that uses a precise series of ported slots along the length of the microphone body to cancel out unwanted low-frequency buildup regardless of distance. When an American radio host leaned into an RE-20, the proximity effect vanished. The voice remained crisp, authoritative, and perfectly balanced. Furthermore, the microphone was practically indestructible. It was machined from heavy steel. It could be dropped, hit, or mishandled by station interns without breaking a sweat. Almost overnight, the RE-20 became the undisputed visual and acoustic standard of the American FM radio booth. From late-night jazz stations in Chicago to morning rock broadcasts in Los Angeles, the heavy steel tube manufactured in Buchanan, Michigan, became the trusted translator of the American voice. But the factory was not just building microphones. It was determined to keep its grip on the American living room. The massive patrician speaker of the 1950s had proven EV could build extreme high-end audio, but it was too large and too expensive for the rapidly expanding middle-class stereo market. In the 1970s, as the American stereo store culture exploded, buyers did not want a 5-foot corner horn. They wanted a bookshelf speaker. They wanted a walnut cabinet that could sit on a stand next to a glowing silver receiver, playing a vinyl record without dominating the entire room. Electro-Voice responded with the Interface series. Instead of relying purely on massive cabinet volume, the Interface speakers utilized precisely tuned vented enclosures and, in some models, an active equalizer, a small electronic component placed between the between the receiver and the speakers that electronically boosted specific low frequencies to force a smaller woofer to produce deeper bass. This was a crucial American audio moat. EV was not just selling a wooden box with a paper cone. They were selling a complete, engineered acoustic system. When a college student in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or a suburban family in Ohio walked into a local hi-fi dealership and listened to a pair of Interface A speakers, the effect was startling. They heard the deep, physical bass impact of a much larger cabinet coming from a box that easily fit on a shelf. The stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, was razor sharp. The EV badge on the grill cloth was not a decoration. It was a promise that the engineering was honest. It meant the woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums, was built to take physical punishment. It meant the crossover was stable. The American living room was filled with the sound of a company that treated a consumer stereo speaker with the same ruthless durability it applied to military hardware. The Buchanan factory was running at peak strength. The floor was a massive, highly organized machine of American labor. Hundreds of workers wound voice coils, the coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it. They stamped magnet structures. They tested drivers in massive anechoic chambers, specially designed rooms built to absorb all sound reflections to allow for pure, uncolored acoustic measurement. Electro-Voice had become a sprawling acoustic empire. Local radio stations in Texas relied on the RE-20, Hi-fi dealers in New York proudly demonstrated the Interface series. Jazz records spun in California living rooms, pushed effortlessly through EV paper cones. The factory was producing the tools that amplified America. But the true peak of Electro-Voice's power, the arena where their acoustic engineering would become legendary, was not in the living room or the broadcast booth. It was waiting out on the road, in the massive, deafening concrete stadiums of the modern American concert tour. In the late 1970s, the American live music industry experienced a structural shift. Rock and roll moved out of theaters and into massive, reverberant concrete arenas. The acoustic environments were hostile. The crowds were deafening. Standard public address systems, which relied on older acoustic designs, were failing to keep up with the scale of the audience. The physical problem was high-frequency beaming. In a traditional horn speaker, bass and mid-range frequencies spread out widely into the room, but high frequencies, the sharp details of a vocal or a guitar solo, tended to beam straight ahead like a narrow flashlight. If an American listener stood directly in front of the speaker stack, the sound was piercingly loud. If they took 3 steps to the left or right, the high frequencies vanished, leaving a muffled, muddy echo. In 1978, Electro-Voice solved the geometry of the stadium. They introduced the constant directivity horn. A constant directivity horn, a specifically engineered fiberglass flare that forces high frequencies to disperse evenly across a wide, mathematically precise angle, ensured that the sound did not collapse as it left the cabinet. It was a revelation in acoustic consistency. Suddenly, an American concert-goer sitting in the cheap seats off to the far side of the arena heard the exact same crisp vocal detail as the listener standing dead center in the front row. Electro-Voice began dominating the American stage. But as stadium tours grew larger, the volume requirements became monstrous. Standard speaker cabinets were no longer loud enough. If a sound engineer stacked too many traditional cabinets next to each other, the sound waves would interfere, creating messy, phase-canceled audio. The Buchanan engineers responded with manifold technology, culminating in the massive MT4 concert system in the 1980s. Instead of mounting one driver to one horn, manifold technology physically bolted 4 massive compression drivers onto a single custom manifold, funneling their combined acoustic output through a single horn exit. It was an exercise in brute engineering force. It quadrupled the acoustic power without increasing the footprint of the cabinet. In a massive American stadium, where wind, crowd noise, and bad acoustics could turn a high-budget rock concert into a wall of unintelligible noise, the right array of Electro-Voice cabinets could compress thousands of watts of power into a localized space and project it with enough clarity to make a 70,000-seat arena feel as intimate as a living room. By the late 1990s, EV's dominance in live sound peaked with the X-Array system. The X-Array utilized ring mode decoupling, a physical internal cabinet design that eliminated unwanted mechanical resonances before they could color the sound. When massive touring acts built towering walls of X-Array cabinets across American stages, they were not just renting speakers. They were renting a guarantee that the system would not fail, would not distort, and would endure the physical abuse of being loaded in and out of semi-trucks every night. The town of Buchanan, Michigan, had built its identity around the hum of this production. The factory was at the absolute height of its power. Hundreds of skilled workers operated the heavy machinery. The production lines were shipping thousands of RE20 microphones, interface hi-fi speakers, and massive concert arrays to dealers, studios, and production companies across the country. Electro-Voice had successfully mastered every scale of the American audio market, from a single voice in a radio booth to a roaring crowd in a football stadium. The physical product was flawless. The acoustic engineering was legendary. The badge on the cabinet represented total American reliability. The factory floor in Buchanan was running at peak strength, producing the cabinets and horns that amplified America. But the ledger sheets in corporate offices far away were beginning to tell a different story. The collapse of an American audio empire rarely happens overnight. It usually begins with a quiet signature on a contract, years before the factory floor notices a difference. For Electro-Voice, the small crack appeared in 1969. Al Kahn, the engineer who had guided the company from a desperate South Bend basement to a massive Michigan manufacturing complex, decided to retire. He sold the company to Galton Industries, a large aerospace and electronics conglomerate. At first, the American listener noticed nothing. The Buchanan factory was still producing the RE20 microphone. The engineers were still developing constant directivity horns. The interface hi-fi speakers were still hitting stereo store shelves. The hardware was functioning exactly as promised. But the invisible architecture of the company had fundamentally changed. Electro-Voice was no longer an independent acoustic laboratory. It had become a line item in a diversified corporate portfolio. This was the arrival of the fourth structural force of the American audio market: corporate consolidation and brand dilution. Corporate consolidation, the process where multiple independent brands are absorbed by larger parent companies, does not immediately destroy a speaker. Instead, it slowly shifts the priority from acoustic innovation to quarterly financial efficiency. Under Galton, EV continued to grow, but the executives making the ultimate financial decisions were no longer standing on the factory floor in Michigan. They were managing a sprawling network of unrelated industrial products. Then, the consolidation accelerated. In 1986, Galton Industries was acquired by Mark IV Industries, a massive holding company. Mark IV did not just buy Electro-Voice, they aggressively bought up other historic American audio brands, including Altec Lansing, one of EV's fiercest historical rivals in the cinema and live sound market. Suddenly, two towering American audio empires were forced to share the same corporate umbrella. For the American audio dealer, the shift was disorienting. A local hi-fi store or a regional live sound provider used to choose between the specific engineering philosophy of Altec or the brute reliability of EV. Now, both brands were controlled by the same financial entity. The catalogs began to overlap. The engineering departments were forced to share resources. The fierce, independent pride that had built the Buchanan factory was slowly being diluted into a generalized corporate audio division. The speakers still worked. The X-Array concert systems, massive touring rigs used by the biggest rock bands in the world, were still generating millions of dollars. But the profits were no longer strictly reinvested into Michigan acoustic research. They were siphoned upward to satisfy the broader debts and acquisitions of the Mark IV holding company. Because corporate leadership was focused heavily on the highly profitable commercial and touring sectors, Electro-Voice slowly began to abandon the American living room. Throughout the 1990s, the American retail landscape was shifting violently. Independent stereo stores, the local shops that took the time to demonstrate high-quality wooden speakers to suburban buyers, were going bankrupt, replaced by massive big-box electronics retailers. These warehouse stores did not want heavy, expensive hi-fi cabinets. They wanted cheap, bundled home theater systems. Without an independent leadership team to fight for consumer audio, EV's residential hi-fi lines faded away. The brand that had once placed the massive patrician horn in the American living room surrendered the residential market to soundbars and mass-market imports. In 1998, the corporate maneuvering struck a fatal blow to EV's remaining independence. Mark IV's audio division was sold to Telex Communications, a company primarily known for aviation headsets, dispatch consoles, and intercom systems. Telex did not want to operate a decentralized network of autonomous audio brands. They wanted absolute centralized efficiency. Telex stripped Electro-Voice of its administrative headquarters. For over 50 years, Buchanan, Michigan, had been the brain and the muscle of the operation. Telex severed the two. The executive offices, the marketing departments, and the core decision-making power were ripped out of Michigan and relocated to Telex headquarters in Burnsville, Minnesota. The people who had built the brand, the local managers, the veteran sales representatives, the regional directors who knew every hi-fi dealer and stadium installer by name, were laid off or forced to relocate. The local Buchanan workforce watched as the soul of their company was packed into boxes and shipped out of state. In a recording studio in Los Angeles, an engineer could still speak into an RE20 and hear flawless audio. In a stadium in Texas, a concert-goer could still stand in front of a manifold technology system and feel the bass hit their chest. The physical product was still intact, but Electro-Voice was now trapped inside a massive corporate bureaucracy in Minnesota, managed by executives who specialized in aviation headsets. The Buchanan facility was no longer a proud, independent headquarters. It had been reduced to a mere manufacturing outpost. The administrative heart was gone. The corporate accountants were now looking closely at the balance sheets, and they were about to come for the factory floor itself. As the 21st century began, Electro-Voice was operating under Telex in Minnesota, but a small footprint of manufacturing still remained in Buchanan. However, the American audio market was about to undergo a brutal technological and material shift. The fifth force of the American audio market, technological, retail, and listening culture shift, collided directly with the first force, domestic manufacturing costs. For decades, an American PA speaker was a heavy, passive wooden box. It required thick plywood, heavy ferrite magnets, and massive external amplifier racks to operate. But by the early 2000s, the live sound industry was shifting toward active, powered speakers, cabinets molded from lightweight composite plastics with highly efficient, lightweight Class D amplifiers built directly into the back panel. The market no longer wanted a 100-pound wooden cabinet that required a truck and a team of roadies to move. They wanted a 50-pound plastic speaker that a single musician could carry into a club, plug directly into the wall, and operate with a smartphone. This shift in material science devastated the Buchanan model. Electro-Voice had built its reputation on American heavy industry, milling steel, cutting heavy wood, winding massive copper voice coils, and stamping iron. But injection-molded plastic cabinets and microchip-based amplifiers were significantly cheaper to design, source, and assemble overseas. To compete with the flood of low-cost powered PA speakers pouring into the United States from Asia, the corporate parent had to cut costs. The math of domestic manufacturing was no longer sustainable for mass-market commercial audio. The labor was too expensive, the materials were too heavy, the shipping costs were too high. Then, the final corporate hammer fell. In 2006, Telex was acquired by Bosch Security Systems, a massive German multinational engineering and electronics conglomerate. Bosch was a global powerhouse, but it was not fundamentally an American audio company. It was a company that built surveillance cameras, automotive parts, and ceiling-mounted paging systems. Electro-Voice, once the undisputed king of the American stadium, was now just a specialized division inside a sprawling global security portfolio. Bosch looked at the balance sheets. They looked at the aging, heavy machinery inside the Buchanan facility. The decision was purely mathematical. The remaining American manufacturing could not justify its own expense. The mandate came down. Core production had to leave Michigan. The manufacturing lines for the speakers and horns that had once defined American live sound were scheduled to be moved across the border to a facility in Hermosillo, Mexico, and to other offshore electronics plants. The Buchanan factory, the beating heart of Electro-Voice since 1946, began to power down. The sprawling 64-acre campus that had once employed hundreds of skilled local workers slowly emptied. The specialized anechoic chambers, the quietest rooms in Michigan, went entirely silent. The massive magnet stamping machines were halted. The local engineers, cabinet makers, and assembly line workers who had spent 30 years building indestructible hardware were handed severance packages. But the factory did not just close. It left a permanent, toxic scar on the town that had hosted it. For over half a century, the secret to Electro-Voice's indestructible hardware was heavy industrial plating. The microphone housings and speaker frames were chemically treated to survive battlefields and stadium rainstorms. Decades of this manufacturing process, specifically the use of trichloroethylene and heavy metal plating, had quietly leached into the soil and groundwater beneath the facility. When the assembly lines finally moved to Mexico, the empty building in Buchanan was not just an abandoned warehouse. It was an environmental hazard. The site was investigated by the Environmental Protection Agency. The ground where Alcon had once envisioned a sprawling American acoustic empire was eventually designated an EPA Superfund site, a location requiring long-term, federally managed hazardous waste cleanup. The paradox was absolute. Electro-Voice had spent decades designing audio equipment to survive the harshest environments on Earth. But the environment of the factory itself had become toxic, and the corporate structure had proven far too fragile to survive the globalized economy. The brand name survived. The RE20 microphone was still sold to broadcasters. The X-ray systems were still used in massive tours, but they were no longer born in the American Midwest. The physical connection between the American worker and the American speaker was severed. The original engineers were gone. The factory was empty, the cabinets were plastic. The production moved offshore. The town lost its heartbeat. The ground was poisoned. The showroom went quiet. The badge became a trademark. The American public address empire collapsed. Today, the Electro-Voice badge still exists in the global audio market. It is currently owned by Bosch Security Systems. The brand still manufactures public address speakers, massive line arrays, and commercial audio systems for stadiums and houses of worship. But the modern catalog is vastly different from the Buchanan era. The modern live sound cabinets are predominantly molded from composite plastics. The internal power is provided by lightweight Class D microchips. The components are sourced from a highly optimized global supply chain. The brand survived decades of brutal corporate consolidation, but it survived by completely abandoning the American heavy industrial model that originally defined it. In the American vintage audio community, however, the Buchanan-era hardware has achieved a cult-like reverence. Across the country, dedicated collectors and audio technicians actively hunt for surviving pieces of the Electro-Voice empire. On cluttered repair benches, enthusiasts carefully strip away rotted foam surrounds from 1970s interface woofers, the flexible outer rings that allow the cone to push air, and meticulously glue on fresh replacements to bring the abandoned cabinets back to life. They unscrew the heavy wooden back panels to access the crossover boards, desoldering old, drifting capacitors, and soldering in modern replacements to restore the sharp, original detail of the high-frequency tweeters. In local stereo stores that specialize in vintage hi-fi restoration, an original pair of EV home speakers rarely stays on the call while we share on the showroom floor for long. This preservation is not driven purely by visual nostalgia for the 1970s. The original hardware is rescued and restored because it still proves something fundamental about acoustic physics. A dense, heavy walnut cabinet still prevents unwanted mechanical resonance better than a thin injection-molded plastic shell. The complex passive crossover inside an interface, a speaker still manages to create a startlingly wide, three-dimensional stereo image, the illusion of musicians standing in the room, without relying on modern digital signal processing or software algorithms. Out in the live audio world, a working musician will still drag a pair of heavy, carpet-covered Electro-Voice PA cabinets from the 1990s out of a car trunk for a weekend gig. They do this because the massive ferrite magnet structure and the heavy paper cone can absorb a sudden burst of microphone feedback or a dropped bass guitar without shattering. And in the professional recording industry, a 50-year-old steel-machined RE20 still mechanically rejects the proximity effect flawlessly. It does not require a digital filter or a firmware update to make a human voice sound authoritative. The acoustic engineering was solved permanently in Michigan in 1968, but the physical site of that engineering triumph is gone. The town of Buchanan still carries the complicated memory of the acoustic empire that once defined it. The massive 64-acre factory campus on Carroll Street, where hundreds of Americans once wound voice coils, stamped heavy steel, and assembled the tools that amplified the nation, was eventually cleared. For years, the environmental damage left behind by decades of chemical plating and industrial solvents required intense, federally mandated monitoring as an EPA Superfund site. The sprawling manufacturing floor is gone. The specialized, dead-quiet anechoic chambers are gone. The physical heart of American public address dominance has been replaced by quiet industrial redevelopment, leaving behind only the ghost of a massive manufacturing machine. Yet there is a profound, surprising footnote to the Electro-Voice collapse. While the corporate structure lost its independence and the Buchanan factory was systematically dismantled, one specific piece of hardware completely outlived the system that created it. The RE20 microphone, designed to solve a very specific physical acoustic problem for FM radio hosts in the late 1960s, found an entirely unexpected second life. When the modern American media landscape shifted away from traditional radio towers and moved into digital podcasting, YouTube broadcasting, and internet streaming, thousands of independent creators realized they needed broadcast-quality vocal presence in untreated, noisy bedrooms. They turned to the heavy steel tube from Michigan. Today, the RE20 is the undisputed visual and acoustic icon of the modern digital broadcast. A mid-century analog tool, engineered in a forgotten American factory, now dominates the audio of the most advanced digital communication networks on Earth. The story of Electro-Voice is the ultimate American audio paradox. The engineers in Buchanan built equipment that was literally indestructible. They engineered constant directivity horns and massive stadium arrays designed to withstand the harshest physical environments, the loudest crowds, and the most brutal touring schedules. But the corporate structure built around that hardware was incredibly fragile. A company that mastered acoustic engineering could not survive the financial engineering of the late 20th century. When the American consumer market demanded cheaper imports and the commercial market shifted toward lightweight plastic, the Buchanan model of heavy domestic acoustic manufacturing lost its reason to exist. The company was absorbed. The factory was poisoned. The American manufacturing line went silent. But the sound itself has not vanished. Somewhere in an American basement, a heavy walnut interface cabinet still sits on a shelf next to a glowing silver receiver. The grill cloth is slightly faded. The wooden corners are worn, but the heavy paper cone is intact, waiting for the amplifier to power on and move the room one more time. Every week, we tell the stories of American speakers, audio brands, stereo stores, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, movies, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. See you in the next one.